So we're here to speak about the role of public spaces in cities, and I'm joined by Anna Blennow, Associate Professor of Latin at University of Gothenburg, and Legeby, Professor in Applied Urban Design at Royal Institute of Technology, KTH, in Stockholm. And remotely with us we have Limin, the Director of Research at Singapore's Centre for Livable Cities. Welcome. First, I wanted to start with you, Limin, about why public spaces are essential to city life.
Thank you, Karin, and thanks for having me here. I think that public space is very important because it helps us to understand how we will live together. And the topic of future of the city and how we will live together is very closely tied. And we know that with the pandemic, we have seen how important the role of public space as social infrastructure has been. It was clear during the pandemic that many spaces have been redefined or reclaimed as public spaces, streets that have become living rooms where people dined, appropriated again for walking and cycling, gathering, albeit in small groups and more apart, but all the same, serving as an important link for public life. Its role as adaptive social infrastructure has become even more important and not less. Cities will need to consider ways to create better, healthier, and more inclusive neighborhoods with a mix of public spaces that can support socialization and access to nature near the home. We would also need to consider how we can program our city's public spaces with greater flexibility to manage the density of activities and to serve a wider range of people at different times.
Thank you. And Anne, I wanted to ask you what the role is of architecture and urban design in creating public spaces.
Well, I would like to bring up the importance of public space as something that gives us access to different resources and amenities, but also why it's connecting people. This is the space where we can share streets, parks, and streets with other people, and also learn to live among strangers. And in those public urban processes, that's where we negotiate attitudes, norms, we create rituals, and that makes up the public culture and brings us together as a society. It's not just that we stay for a while or we visit or we walk in the city, but we actually create a community. So depending on how space is configured and designed, it provides good or bad places, public space for those urban processes.
And bringing in the historical perspective, then what does it say? What can you say about the role of actual people in public spaces? Anna?
Yes, it's very interesting to consider what Anna and Limin already said, the role of the people, because the public spaces are not only built by architecture, but by people. The ancient Greek poet Alkaios wrote that cities are not only stones and timbers and the craft of builders. They are constituted by people. And I think that this is a thought that has gained new importance and understanding during the pandemic, because during lockdown, when we saw these beautiful photographs from cities like Paris and Rome during lockdown, totally empty streets, and at first the feeling that these cities have never been so beautiful as they are now, like the perfect postcard or the perfect work of art. But as we all know, that emotion very soon shifted into the feeling of cities becoming totally ghost-like and deprived of meaning when they lacked their inhabitants. So I think throughout history, that is a truth that keeps repeating itself. The people is the cities, and the people is the public spaces.
And building upon that, then, I mean, how do you sort of involve people and have people sort of shape the public spaces?
I think that's really a very good question. And to continue from the ideas that I was sharing just now, I think there's a need for public space to be designed as regenerative spaces, that is networks of public spaces that continue to change and grow with the social and spatial culture of the city, the spaces of adjacencies, encounters, and friction that can only be lively and vibrant if city leaders, planners, and designers engage with users and empower them with some degree of ownership to organize programs and activities to keep such spaces relevant. In Singapore, community place-making efforts were part and parcel of town rejuvenation programs to transform the public spaces in the public housing towns. And so, in a way, we have to remember to bring the public back into the idea of public space.
I see you nodding, Anne. Would you like to build on that?
Yeah, but I think this is highly important, what you bring up. And I think that architecture has the power actually to either separate people from each other or bring people together, and also bring strangers and locals together. So I think it's highly important, if we are to design the socially sustainable city, we need to make sure that it's not closed, that it's open, that we can have an exchange between people. And in addition to that, I think it's important also that we think what we would like to put on the front row, so to say. What do you see from the public space? Because that is a signal that this is important. If we have schools very visible, it's not only that it becomes accessible, but it also becomes a signal that society thinks that schools are important. And if we design them with good architecture, that's also a signal that, okay, we care for our children and we care for education, then that is important. And here we have the possibility to put different things visible in public space. Is it ecosystem services? Do we give them space and can we see them in public space? Or culture? Or do we fill the public space with consumption? Those are signals how people should behave. So that's how architecture can work with trying to get a more sustainable society.
Would you like to pick up on that?
Speaking of sustainability, I wanted to bring up also the idea of greenery, of plants and trees, in addition to the public and the architecture. Because ever since antiquity, trees and plants have been used in public spaces, but perhaps in a more ornamental, decorative way, because the ancient view was that city and nature were totally opposite. The civilized city had to be protected from the uncivilized nature outside the city walls. But this view is now challenged and has to be challenged. We need to bring nature into cities and into public spaces in order to understand that cities are not separate from nature. We need to see cities and public spaces as part of a global ecosystem in order for the cities to survive and to be less fragile to climate change and extreme weather, for example.
So, Limin, could we bring you in on the aspects of greenery and nature in public spaces?
Yes, I'm so glad you gave me a chance to speak, because Singapore has been well known to be a garden city, but now we have a vision of being a city in nature. That means nature comes first and we are city in nature. And new kinds of public spaces have been created, such as naturalized drainage channels and canals, to bring people together in their enjoyment of nature in the city. And these new spaces will create new narratives for public life and will help to define how will we live together in the future. Because we public space in a way has to connect the past and the future, and through nature is where new stories can be woven and new narratives created for the history and future of our public spaces.
So Want to pick up on that?
No, I think this is important for how we, especially during the pandemic, we have seen how important it is to have a public space that we can share with others and do a lot of things. And also we can think of the aspect, who is welcome in public space? Because that also has partly to do with design, that these places are accessible for everyone, even though you have difficulties to walk or move in different ways. So that is also a challenge that we need to address now when we will come to the new normal.
But what was your reaction to the film we watched before in sort of engineering a specific sort of place for people to meet? Is that...
Well, you can see it as a playing field, the scene for something that takes place. So it's not deterministic in the sense that if you design it in this way, we'll definitely have this. But you give the conditions. And you can actually inhibit people to use spaces, and you can welcome people. And then what actually happens, it could also vary over time, but urban design is such a slow materia, so it has to work for 100 years when you build it. So we can not control like the details, but we can provide a good conditions for exchange, for living with strangers, and for doing activities and provide places for those urban processes.
And then how they are used can be a wonderful surprise as well. Yes. Well, thank you so much for speaking to me on this fascinating topic. Thank you.